Greetings and welcome to the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs at Georgetown University. My name is Peter Mandeville, and I'm a senior research fellow at the center. Here at Georgetown, I lead the Geopolitics of Religious Soft Power Project, a multi-year research initiative enabled by the generous support of the Carnegie Corporation of New York, dedicated to exploring and understanding the various ways that religion fits into the foreign policy and external relations of states and governments around the world. Today's program is part of this project, and we're grateful to you for joining us. We are delighted to welcome to the Berkeley Center today Dr. Peter Henney from the University of Vermont. Actually, we're technically welcoming him back to Georgetown because he earned his PhD here. Dr. Henney's presentation today will explore the question, is America's religious soft power effective? This is, of course, a particularly opportune moment to turn the project's analytic gaze towards our own shores as the Biden administration settles into office, and not least of all, because religion seemed to pervade the foreign policy of the outgoing Trump administration in many, often controversial ways. In the interest of time, I'm not going to read out Dr. Henney's full bio, but rather we'll throw up a link in the chat box that you can click in order to peruse his impressive profile. I'll also include a link to the main landing page for the Geopolitics of Religious Soft Power project, where you can learn more about the initiative and also access the wide range of articles, including a piece by Dr. Henney himself from a couple of years ago, our working papers, and video recordings of previous talks associated with the project. We're also excited that in 2021, the project will be publishing not one, but two edited volumes with Oxford University Press, one of which will feature a chapter from today's speaker. Before I hand things over to Dr. Henney, just a few brief words about logistics and our format for today. We'll first hear a presentation from Dr. Henney for about half an hour to 40 minutes or so. And after that, we'll have a period of time available for questions and discussion involving you, the audience. And if you look down at your Zoom controls, you'll see a question and answer function. And you can, at any time during the course of the program, type a question for Dr. Henney into that box. And then when we turn over to the discussion period, I'll moderate a Q&A with him based on the questions that you submit. I also wanted to make sure that you're all aware that we will be recording this session, particularly for the benefit of people who were not able to join us for the live version of the presentation. And I also wanted to let all of you know that because you registered for the event, you'll also receive a link to that recording when it becomes available. So without further ado, let me again extend our warm welcome to Dr. Peter Henney and turn the proceedings over to him.
Thank you. Good afternoon. As Peter said, I'm Peter Henney, an associate professor at the Department of Political Science and the Global and Regional Studies program in the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Vermont. And this talk will be drawn partly from a new book project, but also from this co-authored chapter I wrote with Gregorio Batiza, who's also spoken to this series for the upcoming volume that Peter Mandeville mentioned. Religion plays a huge role in American politics, and it often gets applied to foreign policy as well. We can see a couple of recent examples of this. Early on in the Trump administration, then Vice President Mike Pence gave a talk to a group of religious organizations. And he said that international religious freedom promotion would be a priority for the Trump administration. He followed this up with some concrete policies, things like quickly appointing an ambassador, holding some high-level conferences, and directing aid towards persecuted Christians. Now, there are some issues with these policies, but they do constitute a recognition of the importance of religion as a tool in American foreign policy. And it's a bipartisan recognition. So John Kerry, Secretary of State under President Obama, helped set up the Office of Religion and Global Affairs to help integrate religion into all different aspects of American diplomacy. So we can find a lot of examples of religion mattering, right, being an influence on US foreign policy and the foreign policy of states around the world. The studies that have been part of this project have done great work on this. My collaborator, Gregorio Batiza, wrote a recent book on US foreign policy and religion. But the question to me that's really pressing, the next one we need to move to is does any of this work? Right? Does it have real impacts on the world and American interests? So you could say, sure, there's lots of examples of religion and foreign policy, but it's, like feel-good outreach programs, not really relevant to America's national security, our core interests. Or you could push back, right? People like me would push back saying, no, this is an important tool that directly affects America's role in the world. So the answer to this question matters, no matter what side of the debate you're on. If you think religion is incredibly important, if you think it can transform the world, well, then we need rigorous, hard evidence to back up our claims. We also want to assess the impact of various religious foreign policies to see if they're actually accomplishing anything before we recommend them. If you're a skeptic, if you think religion's not super important, if you think guns and bullets are what really drive international relations, okay. But we want to assess alternative explanations. We want to get a sense for what the others are saying. And it's worth looking into whether using religion as a tool, a soft power tool in foreign policy, could actually complicate American interests. So just to preview my argument, what I'm going to say here is that religious soft power, it's a very effective tool, but it can be a little unwieldy. Okay, religious beliefs are very significant to a lot of people. So when you appeal to those beliefs, it can resonate with them. It can make it easier to draw states and societies together, right, to increase our soft power. That being said, its overall impact is kind of mixed. Military threats, economic inducements, these have a bigger impact or more immediate impact on people's lives. And so often they can kind of drive out the impact of religious soft power. Beyond that, it's almost because religion is so important that can actually cause problems for American and other states' interests. Religious beliefs matter a lot to people, right? They raise suspicions, they can intensify tensions. So this can be a tool that can slip out of control. So you may be wondering why I have a picture from Star Wars up. There's many ways religious soft power is like the Force in Star Wars. It's like the Force in Star Wars. It's this powerful element of the galaxy that the Jedi can use to do great things, but they have to be careful and wise about it, or they can easily fall to the dark side. And this analogy will make sense as we go. So I'm going to explore the nature and impacts of religious soft power by looking back at the early Cold War. This was a time period when America was starting to engage with the Soviet Union. And we're trying to form international coalitions as part of this ideological conflict. So religion played a big role in this. And there's been some great historical studies on this time period. People like Will Imboden, Diane Kirby, Andrew Preston have written in-depth studies, the role of religion in American foreign policy. So we can assess this historical record and use it to analyze the effects of American religious soft power, and then draw on this to develop guidelines for current religious soft power policies. So first, what does religious soft power look like? What are we talking about? So here's a picture of Billy Graham, famous American preacher, known sometimes as God's machine gun. That's kind of religious soft power in action. So one area this came up a lot was in the grand narratives underpinning the Cold War. Now, the Cold War was a military and geopolitical struggle, but it was also an ideological struggle. Struggle between the democratic capitalism of America and the authoritarian communism of the Soviets. So America tried to appeal to this ideological aspect, and religion played a big part in that. Some of this came from US leaders like Harry Truman, trying to frame this as a struggle between the religious West versus the atheist communists. Faith was very important to Truman, and this factored into his foreign policy. So as Inboden said, Truman saw the Cold War as nothing less than a religious struggle, a religious war. And in a 1946 speech, he talked about the Cold War as a fundamental conflict in the world between those nations who believed in God and morality and those who did not. So American leaders framed the Cold War in religious terms, try to convince people to join our side. It wasn't just American leaders, there was also international figures like Pope Pius XII, leader of the Vatican, the Catholic Church at the time. He was very concerned about communism as well. And so he did things like releasing this anti-communist decree, declaring that all Catholics who became communists would be excommunicated. So these religious grand narratives were one attempt to build up and use this religious soft power in the Cold War. But it wasn't just narratives and rhetoric, it was also concrete policies. Some of it was reaching out and engaging with religious figures to draw them to our side. So here's Myron Taylor, as a US diplomat that President Truman sent to work with the Vatican and work towards setting up diplomatic relations, right, to enlist them in this struggle. He also met with Protestants in Europe. The Archbishop of Canterbury, the head of the Church of England, the Lutheran Bishop of Berlin, to try to create an ecumenical alliance against the Soviet Union. We also intervened in the Greek Orthodox Church. They are having a kind of a succession for a new archbishop, and we tried to nudge them in the direction of an anti-communist figure. So reaching out and engaging with these religious figures was a big part of our attempt to build up and use the soft power. There's also propaganda, things like the Voice of America, Radio Free Europe. We would broadcast news and programs into the Soviet Union to kind of increase the attractiveness of America. And religion was part of this. So we'd beam Christian programs into communist areas. We would broadcast Quran readings as well in the Voice of America, and events from the Washington Islamic Center to remind people around the world, Christian and non-Christian, that they're relatively free to worship in America, not so much in the communist states. And so some of this was, came out of the Eisenhower administration, talked about trying to emphasize a holy war aspect of the Cold War, especially when working with Muslim societies to kind of make our side seem more attractive. Finally, we also try to enhance religious allies, so directly gain influence by building up and supporting allies who are pro-American and religious, especially outside of Europe. Here's King Saud of Saudi Arabia. He was the king during the 1950s and early 1960s. And Eisenhower hoped to establish King Saud as the Islamic Pope, in quotes. Basically, a good religious leader that Muslims around the world could flock to and turn against the Soviets. We do this in South Korea as well. So there were long-standing ties between Christian missionaries and Koreans. America tried to leverage those ties to support conservative, Christian, pro-American figures and help them rise to power. Likewise in Vietnam, there were interactions between American religious groups and South Vietnamese Catholics. We use those to kind of convince them of the dangers of communism, support their own anti-communist messages, and then help build up and support pro-American anti-communist leaders. So there are numerous aspects of religious soft power, of America trying to use religion to increase our attractiveness and draw people to our side. Now remember, my argument's not just that we tried, is that it actually worked. So what were the impacts? There were some successes, right? There was some success in drawing people closer to America. Diane Kirby talked about this religious engagement as helping to form a powerful ideological basis of agreement with European conservatives that helped legitimize the Cold War. Successfully framing it as a religious struggle helped to draw some people to our side. And we can see this in specific areas. And so the Vatican was concerned about communism, but they were initially not on board with Truman's containment policy. However, our outreach to them, our framing of the Cold War in religious terms, helped to solidify that alliance and their anti-communist views. We also helped to support the Christian Democrats in Italy, a conservative force, build them up to help them to hold off communist threats. Likewise, in South Korea, these deep ties between American missionaries and South Korean conservatives paid off, helped to lead to the rise of pro-American leaders, solidify this alliance. And it also seemed to resonate with some of the South Korean people. So there are protests where South Korean Christians would march, say, Christians will defend our native land from communist attack. And so this soft power did seem to work in pulling people to our side. But, right, again, these mixed effects. So we did not see people around the world flocking to America. We did not see people around the world turning on the Soviets. There was still pushback on US anti-communist messaging, some suspicion of what we were up to. And we saw persistent anti-Americanism in Europe and around the world. So here's just a picture of a protest in Germany against US nuclear missiles. It's a reminder that the religious soft power had an impact, but it didn't succeed as much as we would have hoped. And some of these religious soft power efforts kind of fell apart. So we tried to build an ecumenical alliance in Europe between Catholics and Protestant Christians. It didn't work. Protestants were kind of worried about working closely with the Vatican. We wanted to get the Russian Orthodox Church to speak out against the Soviet Union. That did not work. So in many areas, this religious soft power fell short. And beyond that, it in some ways arguably complicated American foreign policy. Part of this was that it made it harder for America to back down in the struggle. So people have written about America kind of exaggerating the threat from communism, which led us to take more aggressive stances against communism around the world, leading to some problems. Our religious moralizing framing played a part in this. It also drew some intense religious disagreements into our geopolitical efforts, complicating them a bit. So Inboden talked about the potency of religion led to distrust between Protestants and Catholics and made this ecumenical alliance fall apart. The moral element of the Cold War also opened up America to charges of hypocrisy. So Kirby's written about George Bell, an Anglican bishop, not a big fan of communism, right? He saw the Cold War as a war of faiths. He was also critical of America. So look, America, you've got poverty, you've got injustice. You need to address this if you're going to go after the Soviets for their own failings. Finally, it led us to back some problematic allies. So, King Saud did not become an Islamic pope. He's actually a rather ineffective leader. And this was during a time period when we saw a spread of radical Arab nationalism that was sympathetic to the Soviets. So it's possible that our excitement to have a religious ally blinded us to his limitations. Likewise in Vietnam, right? Ngo Dinh Diem was a pro-American leader who rose up, with the support of America and our Christian allies. He was not super popular. He was repressive. He helped provoke a Buddhist uprising that made things a lot harder for America. So in a way, in an ironic sense, our soft power efforts sometimes failed, not despite of the religious framings, but because of that. So that brings us back to my Star Wars analogy. We can think of it as the Force. It's a powerful force in the world. It can do great things. It can advance America's interests. Religion can help resolve conflicts. But we have to be careful because it can easily slip out of control. Now, a hard-nosed realist can question all of this. I can question all of this. And I was presenting other parts of this research, and an older realist in the room raised his hand. He's like, there's no wars here. There are no alliances formed just because of religion. What are we talking about? So of course other things mattered. Of course alliances will be based on military ties, economic benefits. But this religious soft power did resonate with the people. It did make it easier for America to get our job done. And if you're going to ignore it, you're ignoring half the story. But, right, there's always a but. The downsides of religious soft power are equally apparent. Now, religious soft power did not cause anti-Americanism, but infusing religion into this political struggle raised the stakes, contributed to tensions, made people a little more suspicious, and complicated things. And so in a way, a good way to understand this is to go back to an earlier form of realism, classical realism. People like Reinhold Niebuhr, who warned America of what he called the irony of American history, that our penchant for moralizing, for doing what we think is good, can blind us to the downsides of our actions and cause real problems in the world. And I think this is the case with religious soft power. So what are some of the lessons? I think we can draw both policy and scholarly lessons for today. Okay. On the policy side, clearly, I hope we can see clearly religion can be a tool in foreign policy. Now, I mentioned the Trump administration's emphasis on religious freedom promotion. It ended up being rather narrow, and I think moving forward, we should expand that. Religious soft power can matter in all different areas of American foreign policy and diplomacy. So let's revive and reactivate the Office of Religious and Global Affairs. Let's incorporate religious engagement into counterterrorism and countering violent extremism. Let's expand faith-based partnerships. But we want to be modest. Let's stay away from these grand conferences where we solve all the world's problems. Or let's try to avoid picking out the good moderate Muslims in quotes. Instead, let's have a government strategy driving our religious soft power. So it's not just one-off policies based on funding. And let's look at small-scale local engagement, ways to really work with local actors to build up religious soft power and do good things. This makes it easier to assess their impact and easier to avoid bigger complications in foreign policy. Now, on the scholarly side, there's a few things we can take away here. One is, I think we might be pushing the limits of what the original term of soft power can do for us. Soft power is getting people to want what we want. We saw that. But it wasn't just a case of America generally increasing its attractiveness. there are these specific outreach policies building religious networks. So we might want to rethink the ways soft power works. We also are seeing a few cases of America using religion directly in a crisis, and that might need different terms than just soft power. And this is something I've been working on in some other research, some of my own work, as well as collaboration with Erdi Öztürk, who also presented in this series. Finally, I think we might need to shift the focus of religion on international relations, how we study this phenomenon. We tend to think of it as, religion is a belief driving behavior. That's true, but we also want to understand the potential of religion as a tool, and a tool that can easily slip out of control. Right, so takeaway, religious soft power is this incredibly useful tool for America in the early Cold War. We can draw on these lessons, but be careful in how ambitious we are with them. So thank you for your time. Thanks for having me. Here's some of my contact information if you want to follow up, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Great, Peter. Thank you so much for your presentation and for walking us through your argument. So we're about to move into about half an hour that we have available for discussion and questions and answers with you. There's already a couple of questions that have come in, and we'll get to those very shortly. And in the meantime, I'd invite our audience to go ahead and start thinking about questions they'd like to put to our speaker and to type those into the Q&A screen. Again, for those of you who are just joining us, you can participate in the discussion by using the Q&A function from the bottom of your screen or wherever you have your Zoom controls. If you open the Q&A box, you'll be able to type in a question, and I will use those as the basis for the discussion that I'm going to moderate with our guest speaker just now. Again, for those of you who joined us a little late, welcome. It's wonderful to see the participant list today. It reads like a who's who of scholars and practitioners who are the real shakers and movers and shapers of this field. So Peter, I wonder if I might start by asking you a question about how we should best make sense of the varied and varying ways that religion featured in the foreign policy and external relations of the Trump administration. It seems that, I seem to encounter sort of three different schools of thought about how we should think about that. One kind of says, that there were just a set of strategic priority issues for the Trump administration, where in a wholly instrumentalist fashion, it was judged useful to incorporate religion as a channel of engagement. So it's sort of almost a purely instrumentalist account. A second approach says, well, there were a series of senior national security leaders in that administration, notably, people like former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and Vice President Pence, who possessed themselves very strong religious convictions. And so what we were seeing are, a kind of an argument that really has to do with the personal convictions and predispositions of foreign policy elites as a way to explain that. And then there's a third account that would say that the presence of religion in the foreign policy of the Trump administration was really a reflection of US domestic politics. In other words, US foreign policy became a space in which aspects of US domestic politics were playing out. And so I just wanted to invite you to kind of reflect on the last 4 years and how best you think we should think about and explain what went on with religion in the Trump administration's foreign policy.
Sure. And so full disclosure, I used to work for the Pew Research Center. I ran their Global Religious Restrictions Project. And so I interact with a lot of this religious freedom community, although I left before Trump came to power. I think it's kind of a mix, right? I do think Mike Pence, Pompeo, they sincerely cared about religious freedom. But there's also this I think, was initially a bipartisan community in place that had been working across administrations to raise the profile of international religious freedom promotion. And so the kind of amenability of Trump administration officials combined with this push to give them a lot of institutional access. The problem, though, right, two problems. I think one, as I mentioned, is rather narrow. So we had the wish lists of a lot of religious freedom advocates of, getting a high profile ambassador like Sam Brown back, bringing together governmental leaders. That all happened. But you look beyond that in Trump foreign policy, right? There is not the broader push for human rights, of which religious freedom is part. There are things like, the Muslim ban, whatever you want to call it. When I was at the Pew, like, that's the sort of thing we would register as a religious restriction in other countries. And so it felt cut off from broader foreign policy initiatives of the Trump administration. And there was also a bit of a reframing of it, I think, according to the priorities of maybe Pompeo and Pence, focusing a lot of attention on persecuted Christians who are incredibly horribly persecuted, and I've written on this. But religious freedom is more than that. And it was kind of this emphasis on, violent extremism against Christians. So I think it was a mix of the domestic politics and these policymakers. Now, in terms of the instrumental question, I mean, this gets lobbied a lot at all sort of religious policies, like, oh, you don't really care, it's just instrumental. And I know you have dealt with this critique as well, like, well, everything is instrumental, everything is strategic, doesn't mean it also can't be principled. And just because we disagree with it, you might have guessed I don't agree with all of Trump's religious freedom policies. I don't doubt the sincerity of some of the people involved. I just question their priorities.
Okay, great, thank you. Wow, we have like a good 16 questions that have built up, and we'll try to get through as many of them as we can. I will, asking for the indulgence of our audience, I'm going to try to sort of structure and edit them a little bit on the fly rather than just posing them in the order that they came in, so that we can kind of maybe, rather than having to bounce back and forth between lots of topics, I'll try and kind of group some of the questions that deal with a similar topic. So since I opened with excuse me, a question related to religion in the Trump administration, there are a couple more in that vein, and I'll maybe stay with those and put those on the table for you now, Peter. So I'll combine a couple of these. Marjorie Logman says, I'm a Christian, but what do we do with the form of Christianity Mike Pence puts forward that has, as she sees it, a false narrative of American history? It's one Trump-related question. Let me go ahead and pull out one other that directly voted Trump. This one comes from Cora Alder. Cora, hi, it's good to see you. Could you talk a little bit about how the content of religious soft power has shifted through the years? It seems like under the Trump administration, religious freedom was a core concern. How will this shift under the Biden administration? And thank you, Cora, for putting on the table the question of what we might expect under the Biden administration. There are a couple of other questions that have come in that also ask our guests to reflect on what we might see over the next 4 years. So why don't we go ahead and start with those two? Peter, so back to you.
Great, thanks. For the first question, that I am a Christian as well, and so that would I'd have to draw more in that aspect to me more than my political science work. But I think there's a connection here in that we have to, we can criticize forms of Christianity we disagree with. We can criticize religious freedom policies we disagree with. But I think we need to be careful not to hand the issue over to them. And I disagree with this on some of my fellow progressives, where I think religious freedom, international religious freedom promotion should be a progressive issue. So we can say, oh, no, we don't agree with Mike Pence, let him take his religious freedom promotion. No, we say, this is our value as well. And we just want to redefine it and reinterpret it. And I think you can apply that more broadly to the religious traditions. The second question about the changing nature of religious soft power, this is spoiler alert / advertisement. This is actually the second half of this chapter that I'm writing with Gregorio Batiza deals with some of that. Right. So during the Cold War, it was this religious West versus the atheistic communists. After the Cold War, obviously that went away. And so you saw some broader, Madeleine Albright wrote this great book, The Mighty and the Almighty, talking about the way religion can unite us. It was more of a uniting force. We did see a bit more of a civilizational language slip in with the war on terror, right? This struggle against extremism. And also the attempt to build up religious soft power via, promoting moderate Islam in the Bush administration. And we saw a distinct shift under the Obama administration, I think more towards general religious engagement. So not trying to push a certain religious view, but to leverage common religious beliefs to find commonalities and turn people away from extremism. So this is part of the book project I'm working on that I hope to finish at some point soon. That's kind of what I looked at, where you see this distinct shift when it comes to counterterrorism in terms of religious soft power via moderate Islam under Bush, and then religious soft power via religious engagement under Obama. So it's shifting that way. There's a bigger question of how effective this all is, but we can talk about that as well. So thanks.
Okay, great. Thank you, Peter. You mentioned the kind of positionality and some of the questions and complexities around Islam just now. And so this next question is very explicitly about that topic. It comes from Michael Mwangi in Kenya, who says, Islam as a religion is largely either feared or hated and occasionally shunned in the United States, as it is the case in most Western contexts. Obviously, the religion has played a great role in shaping the American foreign policy, especially in the Middle East and perhaps other nations with sizable Muslim populations. To what extent has Islam as a religious soft power influenced domestic policy during both the Obama and Trump administrations?
Sure. So look at the Bush administration, right? There were issues. There was, I think, demonization of Muslims. This maybe inadvertent, but still the sense of like, we have to change Islam to fix terrorism, which I don't think is accurate. But the Bush administration did also make an effort to find common ground. So Bush, the famous speech at the Islamic Center, talking about commonalities with Muslims. And I think there was an attempt, I was in college at the time, there's an attempt on the part of a lot of us to understand, like, Islam's not the problem. Let's learn more about Islam, learn more about Muslims. And so even though there was this persistent Islamophobia or anti-Muslim attitudes, there's also a desire among a lot of people to better understand and push back on the demonization. But some of it could go awry. So there's a Weekly Standard article that I always like to cite, back when the Weekly Standard was a thing, where they're kind of critical of Obama appointing an ambassador to the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, because they're saying, you can't appoint an ambassador to Islam. And so there's this good-natured attempt to reach out with Muslims, but some of it took this high-level conference type of form rather than smaller scale engagement. And so I think even on the Obama administration, which tried to get away from some of the more problematic aspects of the Bush administration, there's still this broader issue of how do we reach out with and engage with Islam or Muslims. So I hope that helps.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. So this next question comes from Joshua Loisel, and it says, do you think we are heading towards a similar religious and ideological conflict with China? I guess asking whether we might be seeing the emergence of an analogous discursive framing of kind of the United States as the protector of religion, and particularly Christianity around the world, and China as playing the role that the Soviet Union played during the Cold War.
Yes, but I don't think we have to. And I think there's a very justifiable concern about the rise of China, right? It's horrible human rights abuses, the genocide against the Uyghur Muslims. But I think we often slip into this, like, this civilization, that there's this essential difference. And this is, Chinese civilization versus American civilization. And we don't have to do that. And that's, if you look back at the Soviet Union, there's arguments that obviously the Soviet Union had problems, but we might have overemphasized these civilizational differences. So I think this would be a warning to the Biden administration. I think they've, in the election, they felt like they had to take a strong stance against China to kind of outflank Trump, right? Like, I'm tougher on China than you. And again, some of that is justified. But we want to be careful not to lock ourselves into another conflict. So yeah, I think we're heading that direction, but we don't have to.
Okay, thanks. This next question comes from our common friend and colleague, Erdi Oster. Erdi, great to see you. He says, Peter, thanks for this wonderful presentation. Just one simple question. I think he's being a little sarcastic about it being simple. How can we understand religious soft power tools as beneficial for a country? What would be our indicators of success? And this also echoes a question that was posed by Samira Daniels. So I'll combine the two, who simply points out that it's really hard to get or even to think about what would count as data on how well a country is succeeding in exerting religious soft power.
You are both right. It is very hard. This is the chapter of the book I have not written yet, but I think we should think about it like any other tool. So let's think about airstrikes. Airstrikes are a tool to accomplish goals, coerce enemies. They work sometimes, they don't work other times. And so you need a clear definition of what you want to accomplish and then see if it works. So what are we trying to accomplish with religious soft power, with religious outreach? In some of these examples, the goal was to enlist the Vatican as a dependable ally. That seemed to work. When the goal was to build up, a pro-American Muslim leader who could hold off the communists, that did not work. So, we can evaluate like any other program. Of course, being religion, there's something more to that, right? We have to be careful that, airstrikes can do horrible damage, but they don't shift the discourse of a religious tradition. And so we want to take almost like a grain of salt with every sort of seeming success and worry, like, are we doing harm, ethical harm, moral harm, or harm to the co-religious and involved? So I think there's a lot of work to be done here, but I think starting off, let's just treat it like a regular policy tool and analyze its impact like we would anything else.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to move to a question now from Jer Fitzgerald. Hi, Jer, another friend of the project and of the center. And this is another question that asks you to kind of reflect, maybe in a slightly different way, on the relationship between the American domestic realm and US external relations. So Jer says, or asks, to the extent that Truman and others posited the US as a defender of Western Christianity, quote unquote, against the quote unquote godless communists, what is your assessment of the political effects of domestic Christianism on American religious soft power on the international level?
Right. So not to be an academic back, but like some of it depends what you mean by Christianism. If you think like Christian nationalism, right, or just public Christianity. And I think, a general public Christianity, which is inclusive of conservative and progressive faiths and open to religious dialogue, can be an advantage for America, in that there are lots of Christians around the world we can engage with. We can find commonalities of faith. Christian nationalism might be more concerning. It will be more concerning. One is because no matter what our intentions are, it raises suspicions, right? I encounter this a lot when working on religious freedom, where people are like, this is just a smokescreen for spreading American Protestant Christianity, right? When you say laws against missionaries are an infringement on rights, you're just saying, I want my missionaries to go preach to you. So there's a distrust when you combine, the national identity and the faith. And then it might shift priorities a bit. So one example I mentioned briefly was Pence's office directing America to send aid to persecuted Christians in the Middle East. That sounds great. But there are problems where it can kind of intensify disagreements and then raise suspicions about what America is up to. So I wrote a piece from this for Center for American Progress a few years ago. Just like, there are ways to provide aid to help persecuted minorities that also help the entire society. And I think sometimes the, Christianism, if we say that, might cause us to forget the downsides of some of these efforts to help other Christians.
Okay, so I'm going to move on to, again, combine a couple of questions that are asking essentially a similar kind of question about the, let me call it the division of labor between governmental and other actors in the use of religious soft power. So Cora Alder asks, who should be the main actors pushing religious soft power? Government, or might it be better to have a more diversified portfolio of actors, something like sort of public-private partnerships, so I can put it that way, in the realm of religious soft power? And I'm going to combine with that the question that Donald Rogers poses. He says, thank you for this balanced and insightful presentation. At the level of local faith actors in national settings, what do you see as the pluses and minuses with their becoming more involved in collaborating with their governments to achieve, for example, the UN Sustainable Development Goals?
Sure. So in terms of who should take the lead, there's a benefit to having a kind of a decentralized, networked approach where everyone can kind of do their own thing at a small local level. But that means America can't direct it. And some of the things, to what extent do we trust the American government at all, or the Biden administration specifically, to build up and use religious soft power? The public-private partnership idea is attractive, and so this idea of where the faith-based partnerships office that began under Bush continued expanded under President Obama, it did seem to have real impacts on American politics, and so we can continue that. I know there were also attempts to build up these public-private partnerships under Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, not necessarily on religion, but we might kind of look at some of those policies to assess them. And I think maybe that comes down to it is, we don't want to assume anything is good or bad or ineffective. Let's actually assess what has worked in the past and then take these small steps moving forward. Now, for the second question on to what extent should religious groups work with their governments, it's going to depend on the government and your philosophy. I think, on the one hand, shutting yourself off from all interaction with the government, just focusing on helping people or helping your community is desirable because you don't have to sully any of your beliefs, but you do minimize your impact. Flip side is, when you're going to work with the government, you lose control of things and you're maybe less willing to speak out. So just a quick example, I attended an ELCA church when I was in DC. We did a lot of work with the homeless in cooperation with the local DC government. And that was great. It gave us a lot of access and resources. It also made most people in the church, not me, but most people in the church hesitant to go after and criticize the DC City Council when they weren't doing their job. So it's a double-edged sword here. And frankly, this wasn't quite your question, but it relates to it. This was a lot of my concern with the international religious freedom community in the past 4 years. Like, a lot of these religious organizations, they work closely with Trump and the Trump administration to advance their priorities, get stuff done. But in a way, I worry they traded institutional access, traded away kind of their integrity for institutional access. They weren't willing to speak up against Trump to the extent they were earlier under Obama. So there is a downside to working with the government.
Okay, moving along. I'm again going to combine two questions that I think are getting at broadly similar kinds of phenomenon. Angela Scarlis points out you didn't include any conspiracy theories into your frame of reference as an emerging problem within US domestic terrorism. She says faith-based belief systems are not only religions, quote unquote, but any ideologies. Second question on a broadly related theme comes from Kim Denu, who asks, how has white Christian nationalism been used to manipulate American religious soft power, both in the US and abroad?
Sure. So the question of conspiracy theories, we're thinking of like the QAnon, the very concerning conspiracy theory, or even ones that maybe seem less immediately threatening, like having to do with UFOs, paranormal experience. There is a religious element to that, as a faith, right, involved. And so we can look at the analogs between traditional religious belief and these conspiracy theories. We can think of them as cults. But I also think for good policy analysis and scholarship, we also want to have really clear divisions of what we mean. And so I've always been a little hesitant to have religion include anything that is that you have to take on faith, and prefer something directed towards the divine. But of course, there are some gray areas there. So it's an interesting area to look at. In terms of the effect of white Christian nationalism on soft power, some of this I think it gets back to the point I made before about the suspicion. I think people are suspicious of America's efforts because of its Christian nationalism. We've seen some, from my perspective, concerning transnational connections. So in American evangelicals will work with conservative Christians in other countries to help pass like anti-LGBTQ laws. And again, some of the emphasis of religious freedom under the Trump administration did reflect the priorities of, I would say, white evangelical Christians or white conservative Christians. There's this emphasis on persecuted Christianity. That being said, I don't know, it's gonna be hard to escape that no matter where you are, because we can go for an inclusive faith that reaches out and finds the common areas. But when it comes down to it, there are going to be differences in emphasis and belief. And this gets to my second part of my argument, is that religious soft power is effective, but not always effective in the way we want it to be. And that's why I think we need to be a little careful of any use of religion in foreign policy, no matter how benign it seems, because there can be negative implications.
Okay, moving now to a question that in some ways I think follows fairly naturally from where you just left off there, Peter. This comes from John Palakowski, who asks quite simply, how does the increasing diversity of religious communities in the United States affect your overall thesis? I guess your thesis about the effectiveness of US religious soft power efforts.
Sure. So, right. So President Truman could go around talking about, this is a struggle versus the Christian faith versus communist, and the majority of America wouldn't push back on that because they were either Christian or they didn't want to upset the Christian majority. Now, there are many more people who don't identify with religion than nuns, as Pew puts it. There are many Christians uncomfortable with public religiosity. And there are many non-Christians, right? And some of this gets down to, do we think diversity is a benefit or a downside? So there have actually been academic studies on, united domestic politics lead to more cohesive foreign policies, not in terms of religion, but in general. And so you could extrapolate that. Maybe this means it's a problem. Or you could say the growing religious diversity in America is a strength in that it can undermine this suspicion and these biases in US religious soft power that others have raised. Even the non-religious, right, play a part in this. When I worked in the religious freedom community, there was a role for atheists and free thinkers and agnostics. Right, so it's about your belief system. And so saying America is a place where everyone can practice their faith or not practice their faith, it's desirable and it's attractive if we manage to actually live up to that ideal.
Okay. Got a question now from another fellow contributor to the project, Robert Blitt, who's actually going to be doing something for us very soon on the role of the Russian Orthodox Church in Putin's foreign policy, and a topic I know, Peter, that you've also written on. But here's what Robert says. Great talk, Peter. I'd like to hear more about your take on prioritizing religious soft power without alienating progressives in the context of human rights. Here I'm thinking, for example, specifically about needing to make a clear break from the Trump administration's efforts with respect to, for example, the Commission on Unalienable Rights, that report, and also the Geneva Consensus Declaration on promoting women's health, which seems to, he pointed out, already have been scrubbed from the websites of the Department of Health and Human Services and the State Department.
Yeah, thanks for that question. So it gets down to, do we think the problem is religious soft power, or do we think the problem is certain definitions of religious soft power and certain priorities? And so I think, the Commission on Inalienable Rights was, I'm not sure it had much of an impact besides, pleasing those who wanted to see it set up. And so I think we can easily move away from that without harming America's religious soft power efforts. Something like religious freedom promotion is a little trickier, partly because it's mandated by law that we have to keep doing this, right? And partly because of its connection to the Trump administration. And so one option would be, I think, what was done in the Kerry administration, sorry, the second Obama term and under Kerry as Secretary of State, of keep going with some of this stuff, but then build up our own alternative approach, like the Office of Religion and Global Affairs, where religious soft power is not about naming and shaming human rights or trying to redefine what we mean by inclusion. It's about religious engagement and religious accommodation, things like that. But it does get this tricky element. I think there's a justifiable suspicion among a lot of progressives about any use of religious soft power. And frankly, the Trump administration did not help with that with some of their policies. And so as a progressive Christian, I think there are ways to reframe even religious freedom promotion to make it less tied to conservative beliefs. But I'm also willing to admit it might be a distraction.
Okay, thanks. Got one last question I'm going to try to fit in here, again from J.R. Fitzgerald, who asks, to what extent are we missing opportunities to harness our own domestic religious pluralism to push back against the deployment of religious soft power from other state actors, such as Putin's use of the Russian Orthodox Church? This question also reminds me that when the question about the possibility of an emerging China versus US framing of religiosity versus godlessness came up, I had wanted to mention that our Geopolitics of Religious Soft Power project actually late last year published a policy brief that actually looks very explicitly at China's promotion of Chinese Buddhism around the world in certain countries as a form of religious soft power being deployed by China itself, which I think, complicates the idea that one can so simply place China in kind of the realm of being entirely anti-religious overall. But Peter, back to you for a final response to this question on American religious pluralism as a potential counterbalance to efforts by other governments to deploy their own forms of religiously inflected soft power.
Sure. Well, some of it is, trying to emphasize that America is religiously diverse and plural. Other places are not. But people who've tried this, I think what it comes down to is, this theme I've raised a bit is not handing over these issues to the other side, right? That religious soft power does not belong to right-wing nationalists. It does not belong to conservative culture warriors, right? It belongs to everyone. And so I worry if progressives are going to start dismissing a lot of this stuff as this is Trump administration, this is Bush administration, this is right-wing white Christianity, we are losing a major opportunity both to advance America's interests and to push back on the elements of our religious traditions we might find troubling. So I think it's going to take sustained effort by progressives to have these uncomfortable conversations and keep pushing, right? Even though many people, might accuse you of being secret conservative or whatever, like I've been called that several times, right? This does not belong to them. And I think holding on to it and defining it as a progressive issue is one way to do that.
Okay, Well, everyone, we have, I regret, reached the end of our time today. Excuse me. I want to first and foremost thank our speaker, Dr. Peter Henney, for his great presentation and for prompting such a rich and wide-ranging discussion. I also wanted to make you all aware of the next webinar session in this series. In just over 2 weeks, on February 12th, Guillermo Casaros and Amy Erica Smith will be discussing the sources of Brazil's religious soft power. And I've just put into the chat box a link to the event page for that, so you can read more about it and hopefully just go right ahead and register to join us again in a couple of weeks. My thanks to Ruth Gopin, who coordinates all our events here at the Berkeley Center, and to all the rest of the center staff for making these sessions possible. Finally, let me join the Berkeley Center's Director and Managing Director, Sean Casey, and Michael Kessler in thanking all of you for joining us today. Take care and hope to see you all again soon.